Hey juniors, today we're going to talk about the American military versus the British military. So in the top right hand corner of your notes page, go ahead and write today's date, which is 8/13/2014. As always, feel free to pause the video at any moment to get the notes that you need. Our essential question for the day is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the American and British militaries? The essential question does need to be written down in your notes, so make sure that you pause the video and get the essential question written down. So let's talk about the Patriot cause. These first two bullet points are super important vocabulary for you to have that will definitely come up on the LEAP test and also the benchmark. A patriot is anyone who supported the colonists in the Revolutionary War. So these would be people like the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams, anyone who was against British taxation and supported the colonist side. And then there was the Loyalists, and that was anyone living in America who supported the British government. So it could be Boston citizens who still remained loyal to England. Regardless, the Patriots were charged with overthrowing the world's most powerful military. We already know that they can win based on the Battle of Bunker Hill, but nonetheless, their charge with overthrowing the world's most powerful military is still very great. Make sure you get these first two bullet points of vocabulary written down on your notes page. So let's talk about the pre-war American strengths. First off, it's important to note that the colonists started off in a really weak place. They were poorly trained and unorganized, and many of their members joined at a moment's notice off farms and workshops. And these people were called Minutemen. However, it should be obvious from this photo, this should not look like a professional army to you. And it wasn't. It was made up of farmers and silversmiths and any kind of person who ran a daily normal life that was just interested in liberty and interested in breaking off from Britain. And that's what the Minutemen were made of. Let's talk about American weaknesses. The first one is that they were always short on men. Few were trained and many lacked necessary discipline. They also lacked resources and supplies, and there were no money for decent food or clothing. And this photo, as you can tell, is obviously George Washington, who was the head of the Continental Army. He was constantly asking the Sons of Liberty and other organizations for resources and more supplies that they just couldn't give him because they just didn't have them. So it should seem to you from these weaknesses that it's going to be hard for the colonists to win the war based on the disadvantages that they have. Let's talk about American strengths, though. Though they might have been short on men and had very few supplies, but they did have a very strong belief in their cause, and this was known as patriotism. They also were receiving some supplies and help from France, and 90% of their gunpowder comes from Europe. Ultimately, though, it was George Washington who would keep the army together, and he serves as America's greatest strength in the darkest moments of the Revolutionary War. So between George Washington and patriotism, those were probably the two biggest of the colonists' strengths in the Revolutionary War. And it was those things that helped them overcome their disadvantages, like being short on men and supplies. Let's talk about British strengths. Unlike the colonists, they had a professional army of about 50,000. And King George also hired an additional 30,000 mercenaries. A mercenary is someone who is hired to fight. They don't care who wins. It's more they're just there and they are paid to fight for the side that hired them. So the British had a well-trained military and a massive amount of supplies. So all of these advantages should make you think, wow, the British really should have won the war. As we know, of course, they don't. But the British also had weaknesses, and the first one, which was the biggest one, was that they underestimated the colonists. King George, he had no idea that the colonists would work as hard at beating him as they thought. They thought it would take 1 or 2 battles and then the colonies would give up and that would be it. And even though the British had lots of men and troops, there was a lot of distance between the colonies and England, so resupplying troops took forever. So oftentimes, troops would not get the supplies that they needed in time. The other disadvantage was that as the war dragged on, the British people started to tire of paying for the war. Imagine paying money to the government for a war that you don't even see and a war that you don't have any effect on. And naturally, the British people started getting tired of paying that money. Don't forget to write these first 2 bullet points down in your notes. So let's go ahead and summarize what we've learned today. Essentially, the British should have killed the colonists. They had every advantage possible. However, the colonists' strong belief that they could overcome the world's most largest military is ultimately what carried them through. And as we know, the colonists would go on to win the Revolutionary War and create a new country based on the idea that all men are created equal and that everyone should have the same rights as the next person. That's going to be it for Intro to New Material today, guys. Thanks for listening.